The intake hall of Harrow Station had been built to be the last room in a person's life that had any grandeur in it. That was deliberate. Kashuvan Reclamation and Assurance had learned, over 11 years and 9 stations, that a body which had just been made into property behaved better if the making happened somewhere beautiful. So the hall had a vaulted ceiling of fused ice glass hauled up from the moon below, and the light that came through it was the pale green of Greaves' frozen seas, and the floor was laid in long dark slabs that rang under a boot like a struck bell. There were 71 chairs in 9 curved rows. There was a dais of white stone at the front, and above the dais, set into the wall like the eye of a god who had never once looked away, there was the attester. It was a lens the width of a dinner table, ringed in unadorned iron, and it did nothing but see. It had seen every bond sealed in that hall. It had seen every hand raised, every signature pressed, every name spoken. It could not be turned off. It could not be edited. Under Concord law, it was the only witness that could not be bought, and the Orrun who ran Harrow Station were very, very proud of it, in the way that honest people are proud of a lock they have never had reason to test. Wren Calloway sat in the 3rd chair of the front row with her wrists in the most expensive restraints ever manufactured, and she was counting. She was 17 years old. She had a wide, flat face with a break in the nose that had healed crooked, and hair the color of wet sand, cut short with a knife because there had been no scissors in the yard where she had spent the last 8 months. She was not tall. She was built the way people got built on Pharaoh's Landing, which was to say she was built like a thing that hauled, thick through the shoulders and the forearms, heavy in the hips, with hands that were too big for her, hands that had been too big for her since she was 12, hands that had gone into ore slurry and cable drums and the mouths of frozen pumps until the skin across her knuckles had given up on being skin and become something closer to hide. She sat very still. She had been sitting very still for 19 minutes. The restraints on her wrists were a matched pair of sallow and vein Model 9 adaptive bonds, and they were the reason she had come. They did not look like much. That was the first thing everybody said. They were 2 flat bands of dull gray metal, each about as wide as 3 fingers, joined by a hand's length of the same gray, and there was no keyhole, no hinge, no seam. They looked like something a jeweler had abandoned. What they were, underneath, was 40 wraps of Varick monofilament coiled inside a memory alley sheath, and a governor the size of a grain of rice that sampled the strain across those wraps 200 times a second, and a very old idea executed extremely well. The idea was this: do not resist the pull, eat it. When a bonded body pulled, the coil felt the load and contracted. It did not brace. It did not hold. It gathered, took up the slack the pull had made, closed the space the pull had opened, and settled a fraction tighter than before. Pull harder and it closed harder. Pull with everything a body had and it would close with everything the body had given it, and then wait, patient, for the body to give it more. In 11 years of continuous service across 400 stations and 19 species, no bonded creature had ever gotten out of a vein 9. And the reason was not that the vein 9 was strong. The reason was that strength was its food. Wren knew all of this. She knew it the way you know a language you have been beaten in. She had spent 231 nights in the back of a salvage yard on Pharaoh's Landing with a dead vein 9 locked around her own wrists, learning it in the dark, and there was a white ridge of scar tissue around each of her forearms to prove it, and a place on her left wrist where the bone had healed into a knot she could feel with her thumb. She sat in the 3rd chair, and she counted the governor's cycles, and she waited. There were 9 other people in the chairs. 4 were Draskin, big gray slabs of a species that had made the mistake of running cargo for a Kashuvan subsidiary and would be paying for it for the next 11 years. 2 were Orrun themselves, debt taken, ashamed, sitting with their long hands folded and their eyes shut. 3 were human. A boy of maybe 14 with a bad cough, a girl a little younger, shivering, and a man, perhaps 30, who had been crying without sound since they brought him in and who kept turning his head to look at the door as though a different door might open. The children of Pharaoh's landing were not in the hall. They were 4 decks down, in a hold that the manifest called the acclimatization nursery, and there were, by Wren's best count, 62 of them, and one of them was 9 years old and had a gap in her front teeth and a scar on her chin from a fall off a water tank, and her name was Bo. Wren did not think about Bo. Thinking about Bo made her hands want to close, and she needed her hands loose. She counted. The sub-prefect of bond assurance came down the aisle at 19 minutes and 40 seconds with her slate held against her chest, and she stopped in front of Wren, and she looked at her the way a good clerk looks at a form filled out in the wrong color of ink. Her name was Vessine Orr-Talad. She was 2.5 meters of Oran, which meant she was long and narrow and moved as though gravity were an opinion she had chosen not to hold, with a high-domed skull and skin like the inside of a shell, and 4 eyes arranged in a shallow arc. 2 of those eyes were for distance and 2 were for detail, and all 4 of them were on Wren's wrists. "You have been pulling," she said. Her trade was excellent. Oran learned languages the way water learned the shape of a jug. "Yes, ma'am," Wren said. "For 19 minutes. About that." Vessine tilted her head. On an Oran this was not a gesture of curiosity but of correction, the way a surveyor tilts a level. "Then you have added, by my slate's reckoning, 4 millimeters of closure to your left bond and 3 to your right. You have made your own restraints tighter. That is the entire mechanism. It is explained in the intake recording. It is explained on the wall." She gestured with her chin at the placard beside the dais, which said, in trade and in Oran and in 9 other scripts, "Do not struggle. The bond answers. You are not a stupid animal. Your file says you scored in the 90th percentile of your colony's aptitude testing, so I will ask you plainly, why are you pulling?" Wren looked up at her. She had a way of looking up at people that had gotten her in trouble her whole life, and she did not bother to hide it now. "Because it's what you do," she said. "When somebody puts you in chains, you pull." Something happened in Vessine's face, a fractional smoothing, the Oran equivalent of a person deciding they have understood you, and that the understanding is a small, sad thing. She crouched. She came down to Wren's eye level, folding her long legs the way a heron folds, and she set her slate on her knee, and when she spoke again her voice had gone gentle, and the gentleness was worse than anything. "Yes," she said, "that is what your kind do. I have processed 4,006 bonded bodies in this hall, and I have watched the humans pull every time, and I have watched them keep pulling long after the pain begins, and I have never once understood it, and I have thought about it more than I should. Do you know what I have decided?" "No, ma'am." "I have decided that it is grief," Vessine said, "that you are not trying to get out, that you know you cannot get out, that the pulling is simply how your bodies weep." She looked at Wren's wrists again, at the gray bands, at the raw line where the metal had begun to bite. "So, weep if you must. But understand what you are doing to yourself, because I do not enjoy cutting a hand off a child, and I have had to do it twice, and both times it was because they would not stop pulling." She stood up. She was very tall going up, and the green light came through the ice glass behind her head, and she made a note on her slate with one long finger. "Those are Model 9s, she said. "Sallow and vain. Do you know what is written on the inside of the left band against your skin where you cannot see it?" "No, ma'am," Wren lied. "It is the manufacturer's warranty," Vessine said. "It is 4 words. None have, none will." She said it without pride, which somehow made it worse. She said it the way another person would recite the boiling point of water. In 11 years there has been no escape from a Vane 9. Not by a Draskin and they can bend a mooring cleat. Not by a Vosh and they can flow through a grating. Not by anything with hands or without them. The coil is not fighting you. The coil is asterisk listening to you. Every gram of force you spend teaches it exactly how much force you have, and it takes that much and a little more forever until you are quiet. She let that sit. "No one escapes those," she said. "No one. It is not a boast, and I take no pleasure in it. It is simply the shape of the world, and you are 17, and I would rather you learn the shape of the world with both your hands still attached to you." And Wren Calloway, 17 years old, 42 kilos of Pharaoh's landing muscle under a stolen coverall, with her wrists already beginning to swell, and her plan running through her chest like a live wire, smiled at her. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of somebody who has just been handed, free of charge and by a stranger, the last piece of a thing they have been building for 8 months. "Thank you," she said. "That's what I needed to know." 11 months earlier, on the 16th of a month that Pharaoh's landing called Coldfall, a Kashuvan collections tender had put down on the flat gravel outside the settlement's east gate, and 11 Oran in gray had come walking up the road with a writ. Pharaoh's Landing was not a rich place. It was 410 people on a moon that had exactly one thing worth taking out of it, which was a seam of cold-formed iridium 800 meters down, and it had been founded by people who had signed a life support loan, because there had been no other way to be founded. The loan had come from a lender that had been bought by a lender that had been bought by Kashuvan. The interest had done what interest does. And in the 11th year, the settlement had missed a payment by 9 days, and Kashuvan had exercised a clause that nobody in Pharaoh's Landing had ever read, because nobody in Pharaoh's Landing had ever read anything the lenders sent, because reading it had never once changed it. The clause was called surety of maturation. What it meant in practice was that when a colony defaulted, the lender could take bonded miners as collateral against the debt and hold them in acclimatized labor until the debt was discharged, and the value of a bonded miner was assessed at intake by a Kashuvan officer, and the assessed value was applied against principal, and the principal never went down, because the assessed value of a child was a number that Kashuvan got to pick. What it meant in practice was that they took the children. They took them because human children were worth more than anything else in the settlement, not for cruelty, for physics. A human body was a deathworld body, and everybody in the Concord knew what that meant even if they did not like to say it out loud. Humans came from a world with a crushing atmosphere and a violent star, and a biosphere that had spent 4 billion years inventing new ways to kill things. And what had crawled out of that was a creature that could work a reactor scrub deck at 400 rads and walk away, that could hold its breath long enough to cross a vented compartment, that could take a fall in half a gravity and stand up and finish the shift. There was no machine that could be built as cheaply as a human could be raised. There was no synthetic that healed itself, and a child, acclimatized young, taken before its bones finished, could be shaped to a station's environment the way a sapling could be shaped to a wall. They took Bo out of the schoolhouse with her lunch tin still in her hand. Wren had been 800 meters down when it happened, on shift, at the face, with a rock hammer in her fist. She had come up to find her father sitting on the step of their unit with his head in his hands, and a Kashuvan writ on the gravel beside him and his signature on it, because they had put the slate in front of him, and one of them had put a hand on the back of his neck. And Des Calloway was a man who had already broken once, years ago, when Wren's mother died in the number 3 shaft, and a thing that has broken once breaks easier the second time. They said if I signed it'd be shorter, he had said. He said it to the gravel, he would not look at her. They said if I signed she'd get schooling. Wren had stood there in her drill rig with the hammer in her hand, and had felt something go quiet and cold inside her, and it had never once gotten warm again. She had not screamed at him. That was the thing she was proudest of later. She had put the hammer down. She had gone inside. She had washed the slurry off her arms in the tin basin, and she had sat down at the table, and she had picked up the writ, and she had begun to read it. It took her 4 hours. It was in trade, and trade was not her first language, and the writ was written in the special dialect of trade that exists solely to be technically comprehensible and functionally impenetrable. But Wren Calloway had a skill that nobody in her life had ever thought to call a skill, because it looked from the outside like plain stubbornness, and it was this: she could not be made to stop reading something because it was hard. By dawn, she had a list of 19 words she did not know. By the end of the week, she had found, in the back of the salvage yard, where the settlement dumped everything the company would not buy, a cracked Concord data stone out of a decommissioned court tender, and she had traded a month of her food ration to old Maris for the reader that would open it. And she had begun, at 17, with 2 hours of sleep a night and a full shift underground, to teach herself the bond law of a civilization that had decided her sister was a line item. She was not smart exactly. She would have told you that, and she would have believed it. She was 90th percentile on a colony of 410 people, which was not saying much, and she had never in her life had a thought that arrived elegantly. But she had 2 things. She had a body that had been made by a world that killed the weak, and she had a mind that did not know how to be told no. The data stone had 400,000 documents on it, and most of them were useless. Wren read them anyway. She read shipping tariffs and salvage precedents, and a 200-page argument about whether a moon counted as real property, and somewhere in the 3rd month, at 2 in the morning, with her eyes burning and her father asleep behind the curtain and the yard's 1 lamp guttering, she found the Concord of bonds. It was old. It was older than Kashuven, older than the Oran spaceflight, older than the human species had been out of its own gravity well. It had been written by 9 civilizations who had just finished a war over exactly this question: who may be owned, and how, and on what proof? And it had been written by people who were sick to death of the answer being whoever is holding the rope. And in Article 9, under the heading "The Nature of a Lawful Bond," it said a thing that made Wren Calloway put the reader face down on the table and go outside and stand in the cold with her hands shaking. A bond is lawful only where consent is true. A bond that holds a willing hand needs no strength. Therefore, the strength of a bond is not evidence of its lawfulness, but only of its maker's craft. Where a bonded body frees itself from a lawful restraint, unaided and without instrument, the restraint is thereby shown to have been applied to an unwilling body, for the willing do not flee, and the maker has warranted that the unwilling cannot. Let such a bond be void. Let every bond sealed under the same warranty be brought to audit. She read it 11 more times. She read it until the words stopped meaning anything, and then she waited until they meant something again. Here is what it was. It was arrogance, fossilized into law. 9 civilizations 3,000 years ago had wanted to make it impossible for a slaver to claim that a struggling body had consented, and so they had built a trap out of the slaver's own bragging. You say your restraints cannot be escaped. Fine. Then if one is escaped, either you lied about the restraint or you lied about the consent. Either way you lied, and everything you sealed with that lie comes apart. It was a beautiful piece of law, and it had lain in the dark for 3,000 years without ever being used one single time, because in 3,000 years, nobody had ever escaped. The Concord had made a door, and then made it so heavy that no one had ever tried it. Wren went back inside. She sat down, she looked at the door. And she said, out loud to the empty room in a voice that surprised her, "I have hands." The Vane 9 came out of a prison tender that had come down hard on Pharaoh's Landing's North Plain 19 years before, and had been picked over ever since by 4 generations of scavengers who had taken everything worth taking and left the restraints, because nobody wanted them and nobody could sell them, and nobody, on a moon of 410 people, wanted to be the person who owned a pair of slave cuffs. Old Maris had them in a crate under her counter. She sold them to Wren for the reader Wren had bought from her, straight trade, and she looked at Wren for a long moment while she did it, and then she said, "Don't tell me." "I wasn't going to." "Good," said old Maris, and turned around, and did not turn back until the girl was gone. The cuffs were dead. The governor's power cell had gone flat 2 decades ago, but a Vane 9 did not need power to grip. That was the elegance of it. That was what Sallow and Vane had built their name on. The coil was mechanical. The coil was a spring that had been taught a shape. The governor only made it clever. The coil made it inescapable. And even dead, even inert, a Vane 9 would close on a wrist and hold it. So the first thing Wren did was find a way to make it live. It took her 6 weeks. She robbed a cell out of a dead survey drone, and a second out of the settlement's broken weather mast and burned 3 of them, getting the polarity wrong. And on the night the governor woke up, it woke up with a small dry click that she felt through the bones of her arm. And the coil breathed. That was the only word for it. It breathed, a fractional expansion and contraction, like a thing waking up and taking stock of the wrist it had found itself around. Then she started to learn. The yard behind Maris's was a walled square of frozen mud with a heap of hull plating on one side and the wreck of a hopper on the other. And Wren went there every night after shift for 231 nights, and she locked the Vane 9 around her own wrists, and she fought it. She learned in the first week that Vessine Orr-Talad was telling the truth. Pull and it eats the pull. She pulled until the tendons in her forearms stood out like cable, and the coil answered by taking 4 millimeters of her wrist and never giving it back. And by the end of that week, her hands were purple to the fingertips, and she had to sleep with her arms above her head to keep the swelling down, and she had learned nothing except that the thing was exactly as advertised. She learned in the 2nd month that it could not be cut, not by anything in the yard. She took a diamond-lipped cutting wheel to a spare coil, and the wheel came apart and put a piece of itself through the meat of her calf, and she sat down in the frozen mud and picked it out and stitched the hole with fishing line, and went back to work. She learned in the 3rd month that it could not be frozen. Grieve cold, hull cold, the kind of cold that made steel go to glass. The Varick coil did not care. She learned it could not be heated. She got a spare band up to a temperature that turned the hull plate under it the color of a sunset, and the coil sat in the middle of that glow like a bored animal. She learned in the 4th month that she was going to fail. That was the worst night. She sat in the mud with her wrists locked together and her breath coming out white, and she understood, with a clarity that had no self-pity in it at all, that she was a 17-year-old girl with a rock hammer and a stolen data stone, and that the thing on her wrists had been designed by a civilization with 10,000 years of metallurgy, and that it had held 4,000 bodies stronger than hers, and that in 9 days a Kashuvan tender was going to lift from Harrow with 62 children on it, and go somewhere she would never find. She sat there for a long time. And then, because she did not know how to do anything else, she started pulling again. Not to escape, just to pull. Just because it was, as she would say later to a woman with 4 eyes, what you do. And that was when she felt it. She had been pulling in a rhythm without knowing it, a slow, dumb, exhausted rhythm, 3 counts of hard load and 1 of slack, over and over, for maybe half an hour, the way you rock a thing that hurts. And somewhere in the middle of it, the coil had stopped waiting for her. It had started arriving early. She felt it in the meat of her left wrist. The tightening came a quarter beat before her pull did. It was anticipating. It had listened to her long enough to build a picture of her, and now it was closing on the girl it expected instead of the girl that was there. Wren stopped. She sat in the mud with her heart going like a drum, and she said out loud to nobody, "You learn asterisk." She went back to the data stone that night and found the Sallow and Vane Technical Bulletin, a marketing document, 40 years old, written for procurement officers, thick with the particular smugness of an engineer who has been told he may boast. And there it was, in the 4th paragraph, under a heading in a font meant to look like handwriting. The Model 9 governor does not merely respond. It learns the hand. Within 90 seconds of consistent loading, The predictive circuit constructs a force profile of the wearer and pretensions the coil in anticipation of load, eliminating the millisecond lag inherent in reactive systems. The bonded body is not fighting a lock. The bonded body is fighting itself an instant ago. Ren read that sentence 40 times. The bonded body is fighting itself an instant ago. She put down the reader. She went out into the yard. She sat down in the mud in the dark with the cold coming up through her and the coil breathing on her wrists, and she thought about the shape of the thing she had just been handed. A machine that predicts is a machine that can be lied to asterisk. The Orrun were not liars. It was not that they were saints. Ren had met enough Kashuvan men to know better. It was that their whole civilization ran on record, the attester, the ledger, the sealed word. They had built a world where the truth was cheap to check and a lie was expensive to maintain, and over 10,000 years, a species like that stops asterisk practicing. They still lie, the way a man with a car still walks, badly, rarely, and only downhill. And when they build a machine to hold a body, they build it to be strong, and they build it to be smart, and it never once occurs to them to build it to be asterisk suspicious asterisk, because the idea that a body might spend 11 minutes teaching a lock a false picture of itself, purely so that it can betray the lock at the moment of its greatest confidence, that is not a thought that lives in an Orrun head. It lives in a human one. It has lived there for 100,000 years. It is the oldest trick the species has. Be predictable until it matters. And underneath the trick, holding it up, there had to be the other thing. Because a lie alone would not break Varic alloy. A lie would only put the coil in the wrong place at the wrong moment overwound, contracting hard on a load that was not there, all 40 wraps pulling against each other with nowhere to send the strain. To turn that into a fracture, something had to hold the deformation. Something had to fold the coil against itself and keep it folded while the governor screamed and cycled and tried to correct, 200 times a second, for as long as it took. Something had to hold through the correction, past the point where a body says stop. That part was not clever. That part was just what she was. The next 140 nights, Ren Calloway went into the yard and taught herself to break her own hands. She learned that the coil's contraction had a backstroke. It had to. To gather, it first had to let go 4 milliseconds of micro-release, a breath before the bite, buried so deep in the cycle that no instrument in the yard could see it. But she could feel it. 231 nights of a thing on her wrists, and she could feel the whole cycle the way a rider feels a horse, and inside every gather there was a tiny, tiny slackening like a flinch. She learned that if she drove her wrists together on the flinch, folded them inward, wrong way, into the space the coil had just made, the coil would find itself contracting on a shape that was collapsing instead of pulling, and it would overwind, and she could feel the whole band go strange under her skin, a shudder, a wrongness, a spring being asked to be a knot. And she learned that the governor corrected it in about 0.6 of a second. 0.6 of a second, that was the whole game. She had to hold the fold, hold her own wrists crushed together at an angle they were not designed to occupy, hold them there against 40 wraps of alloy that were now closing on her with everything they had, for long enough that the coil could not unwind itself back into a coil, and could only go on winding and winding until the alloy ran out of ways to be alloy. Her best hold in month 6 was 2 seconds. It cost her a torn ligament and a night of vomiting from the pain. Her best hold in month 7 was 5 seconds. It cost her the knot on her left wrist, a scaphoid she had cracked and let heal crooked because there was no one on Pharaoh's Landing who could set it properly. She never got the coil to break, not once, not in the yard. But in the last month she started to understand why, and the why was small and terrible and simple. The coil she had was 19 years old, and its wraps had gone slack with age, and a slack coil could overwind forever without ever reaching the strain that snapped it. She was practicing on a tired thing. To break a vein 9 she needed a new vein 9, tight and fresh and hungry, wound to factory tension, so that when she asked it to eat a lie it would eat it with its whole strength. She needed a bond that had just been put on her by somebody who believed in it. She needed to be arrested. She told her father on a Tuesday. He sat at the table with his hands around a cup he had not drunk from, and he listened to the whole thing, the writ and the data stone and Article 9 and the yard and the coil and the 6/10 of a second, and when she was done he was crying, and when he could speak he said, "You'll die. Maybe. They'll take your hands off." She said, "The officer on the writ, she said they take the hands off if you fight the bonds." "Then they take my hands off," Wren said. "Dad, look at me." He would not. She waited. She had waited 11 years for this man to look at her, and she found she could wait a little longer, and eventually he did. "Beau is 9, she said. "In 11 years, when she's 20, they will have used her up. That's not a guess. It's on the manifest." Acclimatized labor has an average service span of 9 years, and then they sell what's left of you to a hospice contractor, and the hospice contractor bills your family for the disposal. It's in the asterisk paperwork asterisk, Dad. They wrote it down. They wrote all of it down because they're so sure they're allowed. She reached across the table and took his hands, and his hands were shaking, and hers were not. "They wrote down the part that hangs them too," she said, 3,000 years ago, and nobody's ever been able to use it because nobody's ever gotten out of a pair of cuffs. She squeezed. "I'm going to get out of a pair of cuffs." Des Calloway looked at his daughter, at the crooked nose, at the hands that were too big for her, at the white ridges of scar around both forearms where she had spent 8 months teaching a machine to trust her. And he did the only brave thing he had left in him, which was to say nothing, and let her go. 3 weeks later, she walked into the Kashuvan checkpoint at Coriol Transfer with a forged surety tag around her neck, and a manifest number that belonged to a dead girl. Sub-Prefect Vessine Orr-Talad had been in bond assurance for 11 years, and she was, by every measure the Concord had invented, good at it. She was not cruel. She wanted that understood later when the arbiters asked. She wanted it in the record, and the record, when they went and looked, agreed with her. In 11 years she had never once falsified an entry. She had never taken a Kashuvan gratuity. She had twice reported her own superiors for procedural violations, and both times she had been passed over for promotion, and both times she had filed her next report anyway. She ran her integrity check on every bond before she sealed it, every single one, 4,006 times, because the manual said to, and because she was the sort of person who did what the manual said even when the manual was long and nobody was watching, and the bond was going on to a child. She was, in short, an honest woman in a machine that ran on honesty, the way a mill runs on water, and she had never once thought to ask where the water came from. She stood at the front of the intake hall with her slate and watched the human girl in the third chair. The girl was pulling again. She had been at it on and off for another 20 minutes. Vessine had told her to stop, and the girl had said, "Yes, ma'am," and then had gone on doing it, and the maddening thing was that she was not doing it asterisk hard. She was not throwing herself against the bonds the way the Draskin in the back had done for the first hour before it wept and stopped. She was pulling in a slow, steady, almost bored way, the way a person taps a foot. 3 counts of load, 1 of slack, 3 of load, 1 of slack. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was even. Her lips were moving very slightly. She was counting. Vessine's slate showed the bond telemetry in a soft ladder of green. Load, nominal. Closure, 7 left/6 mm right. Wearer profile, converging. Predictive lock, engaged. Predictive lock, engaged. The governor had learned the hand. It always did, eventually, and once it had, the fight was over in every way that mattered. The coil now knew this girl better than the girl knew herself, and it would meet her before she arrived forever. Vessine went down the aisle again. "You are making my instruments think you are stupid," she said, and I do not believe you are." The girl opened her eyes. They were brown and steady, and they had a quality that Vessine had never seen in a bonded body and would spend the rest of her long life trying to name, not defiance exactly, not hate, something more like *patience*, the look of a person standing at a bus stop. "Ma'am," said Wren Calloway, "can I ask you a question?" "You may." "The coil, when it tightens, does it let go first?" Vessine stopped. It was a strange question, and it was strange in a way that she could not immediately classify, and Vessine Orr-Talad had spent 11 years learning to be suspicious of anything she could not immediately classify. But it was also, and this was the part she would think about, afterward in the small hours for years, it was also a question about her subject asterisk, her specialty. The thing she was proud of, the one topic in the galaxy on which she was, genuinely an expert, and about which no one had asked her a real question in a decade. "Yes," she said before she had decided to. "It must, all ratchets must. To gather, the coil releases 4 milliseconds of micro-tension and then closes on the slack. It is the only moment in the cycle where the bond is not, technically, holding you." She heard herself say it and felt a small cold finger touch the back of her neck, and she added quickly, firmly, the way you close a door. "It is 4 milliseconds, 200 times a second. Your nerve conduction alone is 30 times slower than that. There is no creature alive that can act inside that window." "No," Wren agreed, "there isn't." She said it so easily. She said it like a person, agreeing that it was raining. "Then why do you ask?" "Because I wasn't going to act inside it," Wren said. "I was going to be already there." And she smiled again, that same smile, the wrong smile, the one that had no fear in it, and Vessine Orr-Talad, standing in the green light of the hall she had worked in for 11 years, felt, for the first time in her professional life, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being handled. She lifted her slate. Wren had 11 minutes of teaching in her. She had worked it out in the yard, with a stopwatch made from a dead drone's clock, and she had worked it out again in the holding pen at Coriol, and she had worked it out a third time in the dark of the tender on the way up to Harrow, with 61 other bodies breathing around her. 90 seconds for the governor to build a profile. 6 to 8 minutes for the profile to harden, for the predictive circuit to stop sampling widely and start trusting its model, narrowing its guesses, leaning in. And then a window, maybe 90 seconds long, where the coil was at its most confident and its most wrong, where it had decided who she was and had stopped checking. Be predictable until it matters. So for 11 minutes, she was the most predictable creature in the Concord. 3 counts of load, 1 of slack, always the same load, 110 kilos of pull, which was nothing, which was less than she used to lift a hopper gate, which was a lazy human girl's idle fidget, always the same slack, always the same angle of the wrists, the same set of the shoulders, the same tension through the same chain of muscle. She fed the governor a girl. A specific girl with a specific hand, who pulled straight back and pulled soft and pulled tired, and would go on pulling straight back and soft and tired until the end of time, because she was 17 and stupid and grieving, and everyone knew that was how humans wept. And around her, the intake hall went on. The Draskin at the back had begun to snore. The boy with the cough coughed. The man who had been crying had stopped crying and had begun to talk to himself, quietly, about a woman named Ellery. 2 Kashuvan orderlies came in and took the shivering girl out through the side door, and she did not fight, and Wren watched her go with her 3 count never wavering, and something in her chest went white and silent, and she kept her rhythm. Behind the dais, an old Grenik was mopping. Wren had seen him when they brought her in. Grenik were slow, 6-limbed, low and broad, with a hide like wet stone and a mouthparts arrangement that made trade almost impossible for them, and they were the most common custodial species in the Concord for a reason that everybody knew and nobody said. They could not lie. It was not a moral position. It was neurology. A Grenik could refuse to speak, and often did, but it could not put a false statement into the world. The thing simply would not form. So you could put one in a room full of your secrets, and it would clean the floor and say nothing. And if nobody ever asked it a direct question, nobody would ever have a problem. The old Grenik mopped in a slow figure eight and did not look up. And as he passed the third chair, he set one of his lower hands, very briefly, flat on the floor beside Wren's boot. 4 taps, a pause, 2 taps. Wren's rhythm did not break, but her eyes came up. 4 and 2, 42. It was the number she had given him 3 days ago in the transfer pen at Coriol, the number of the manifest line she needed. How many are left in the nursery? How many of ours? And she had not been sure he had understood her, and she had not been sure he would answer, and she had been entirely sure that asking a Grenik for a number was the only honest question anyone had asked him in years. 62 children had come up from Pharaoh's Landing. 42 were still on Harrow, which meant 20 had already gone out. In the 8 months she had spent in a frozen yard learning to be a lie, and there was nothing on the face of the universe she could do about that, and the grief of it went through her like a spike, and she counted through it. 3, 2, 1. Slack. Vessine Orr-Talad was coming back down the aisle with her slate held out in front of her, and all 4 eyes fixed on it. Your telemetry, she said, is doing something I have not seen. Ma'am. The profile has converged to a tolerance of 4 grams, 4 grams asterisk in 11 minutes. Vessine's voice was not gentle now. A body does not do that. A body has a heartbeat. A body has a tremor. A body varies. She looked up. You have made yourself into a asterisk metronome asterisk. Yes, ma'am, said Wren. Why? And Wren Calloway said, so it would believe me. Later, much later, in a hearing chamber on Concord Vault with 9 species watching and her hands in steel and gel, Vessine Orr-Talad would be asked to describe what happened next, and she would take a long time to answer. And when she did, she would say that the trouble with describing it was that it did not look like strength. It looked like a girl folding up. Wren came out of the slack on the wrong beat. That was all. That was the entire trick. 3,000 years of law and 8 months of frozen mud and 231 nights, condensed into one wrong beat. The governor leaning in, certain, predicting, pretensioned the coil for the pull that was coming. 110 kilos straight back, right on schedule. And instead of pulling back, Wren Calloway drove her wrists together. She folded them inward, crossing at an angle no restraint anticipates because no restraint is asterisk for asterisk it, into the 4-millisecond flinch. She was not fast enough to react to the flinch. No creature was, but she did not have to be, because she had known where the flinch was going to be for 11 minutes. And the coil, contracting with everything it had onto a load that had ceased to exist, closed on nothing. 40 wraps of varic monofilament gathered slack that was not there, and pulled against each other and began, for the first time in the operational history of the Sallow and Vane Model 9, to wind themselves into a knot. The bands went hard. Wren felt it, that shudder she knew, that wrongness, a spring being asked to be a stone, and then she felt the governor notice. 200 times a second it noticed. It cycled. It tried to correct. It tried to unwind and reseat and find the girl it knew, and to do that it needed her wrists to come apart just a little, just enough to give it back its geometry. And Wren held them together. That was the part that took the rest. She had 30 kilos of adductor and forearm and shoulder in it, and she put in everything else she had. And she had a lot. She had Pharaoh's Landing. She had 1,100 meters of ladder a day. She had 4 years on the Orpheus swinging a hammer that a grown Oran could not have lifted twice. She had a body that had come out of a world with a heavy sky and a violent star and 4 billion years of predators. And she folded that body around 0.6 of a second and refused to let go of it. The first thing to go was her left thumb. She felt the joint come out of its socket with a sound she felt rather than heard, a wet click up the arm, and she used it. Let the ruined hand collapse smaller, let it fold further into the loop, because a smaller hand meant a tighter fold, and a tighter fold meant a deeper knot. The second thing to go was the scaphoid in that same wrist, the old crooked break, and it went with a grinding that filled the whole world, and she screamed. She screamed with her mouth wide open and her eyes wide open, and she did not stop, and she did not let go. And later people who were in the hall would say it was the scream that they remembered, not because it was loud, but because of what was in it, which was not agony. It was arithmetic. She was counting. 1. The Orrun in the hall had come to their feet. Vessine had dropped her slate, it clattered on the dark stone and lay there flashing a cascade of red she never saw. Because an Orrun body cannot do what that girl was doing. It is not a question of will. The Orrun nervous system has a hard interrupt. At a certain load of tissue damage, the motor cortex is simply disconnected the way a breaker throws, and the limb goes slack, and the creature stops. 10,000 years of Orrun civilization, and no Orrun has ever chosen to keep pulling on a broken hand, because no Orrun can asterisk. 2. The coil was screaming now too, audibly. A thin rising whine as 40 wraps of monofilament wound past every tolerance their designers had ever tested, and the sheath began to bulge, and the smart gray metal went, in patches, the dull blue of alloy under strain. 3. Her right wrist broke, both bones distal clean. She held. 4. And the old Greenock, who had stopped mopping, who was standing very still with his mop in one hand, and his 4 other hands flat on the floor, would testify. Because a Greenock cannot lie, and this Greenock had waited 11 years for someone to ask him a direct question. That at that moment, the human female was not fighting the restraint at all. She was waiting for it. 5. The Model 9 bonds of Wren Calloway blew apart. They did not open, they did not release. They came apart the way a flywheel comes apart, all at once in every direction, 40 wraps of stored elastic energy finding the only exit that overwound alloy has ever had. And the sound they made in that vaulted hall of ice glass and bone-dark stone was not a click and was not a snap. It was a crack like a rifle shot doubled, and the echo went up into the vault and came down in pieces. Fragments went across the room like shrapnel. One shard, a curl of Varick coil the length of a finger, crossed 20 meters of intake hall and buried itself 4 centimeters into the wall beside the attester, and hung there, and glowed a dull cherry red for 11 seconds, and cooled and stayed. Silence. Somebody's mop fell over. Wren Calloway sat in the 3rd chair of the front row with her hands in her lap, and her hands were free, and they were ruined, the left one already black, and swelling around a thumb pointing the wrong way, the right one hanging wrong at the wrist, and her forearms were running with blood from a dozen places where the sheath had opened her, and she was breathing in the huge shuddering way of a body that has spent absolutely all of itself, and has been asked to keep living anyway. She looked at her hands. She had known she could do it. She had known it in the same way you know you love someone, which is to say she had never once been sure. Then she put them on the arms of the chair, and she pushed, and she stood up. She stood up in front of 71 chairs and 11 witnesses and the eye of the attester, in the green light of a moon that had never once been kind to anybody. And she turned to face the lens, and she spoke, and her voice was a wreck, and it carried anyway, because the hall had been built for grandeur, and grandeur cuts both ways. Attester, she said, my name is Wren Calloway. I was born on Pharaoh's Landing. I never consented to any bond, and I never signed any surety, and I was put in restraints by an officer of Kashuvain Reclamation and Assurance 19 minutes ago. She coughed, and something in her chest was wrong, and she went on, and I have freed myself from those restraints, unaided and without instrument, and I claim contest of body under Article 9 of the Concord of Bonds. The lens did not move. It never moved. The Maker warranted that no unwilling body could escape, she said. Their words are on the inside of the cuff. None have, none will. She spat blood onto the dark stone floor. Well, one has. And then, because she had thought about this part for 8 months, because she had known that the law only mattered if you named its whole shape out loud where the record could hold it, she said, every bond Kashuvan has sealed under that warranty is void until audit. All of them, on every station. I want the count. Somewhere behind her, very slowly, an old Greenwich custodian began to walk toward the dais. Vessine Orr-Talad had not moved. She stood in the aisle with her hands empty and her slate at her feet, and on the slate's cracked face, in the neutral gray typeface that the attester used for the only kind of statement it was capable of making, there was a single word that Vessine had never seen on a Kashuvan slate in 11 years, and had assumed, in the unexamined way one assumes the sun, that she never would. Contested. Undersecretary Thoros Vale-Canth was on the observation gallery above the intake hall when it happened, because he was always on the observation gallery when a new colony intake was processed, because he liked to see what he had bought. He was Aron, and he was old for it, and he had been with Kashuvan since it had been 3 ships and a lawyer. He was not a monster in any of the ways that make monsters easy. He had a spouse he was faithful to and 2 clutch children he had raised carefully and a reputation in the sector for being the man you went to when a thing had to be made lawful. He had built the surety of maturation clause himself over 4 years, working with 11 lawyers, and the thing he was proudest of was that not one word of it was a lie. Every sentence was true. It was only the arrangement that was murder. He watched the human girl blow her bonds apart across 20 meters of hall, and he heard her speak the words of contest through the gallery pickup. And before the echo had finished coming down out of the vault, he was already moving, because Thoros Vale-Canth had spent 40 years understanding exactly one thing better than anyone else alive, which was how much a piece of law weighed. Article 9 weighed everything. If that girl's contest stood, then the Vein 9 warranty had failed, and if the warranty had failed, then every bond Kashuvan had sealed under it was void pending audit. 1,412 bonds, across 9 stations over 11 years, most of them children, most of them still alive, all of them entitled to counsel and repatriation and restitution, and God help him damages, and the company would not merely be fined. The company would be unmade. Charter revoked, assets attached, officers, including him, held to personal liability under the Concord slaving statutes, which had exactly one penalty, and it was not a fine. So he did not panic, he did something much worse, he got to work. Seal the hall, he said into his collar, medical to the intake floor. The unit in chair 3 has suffered a catastrophic restraint failure and is in shock. She is to be sedated and stabilized. A beat. And log a Class 4 device fault on those bonds, retroactive to seal, defective unit, 1 bad coil out of the batch. That was the play. It was elegant and it was almost certainly going to work. Because Article 9 only bid if the restraint had been lawful if the bond was defective, if the cuffs that came apart were a manufacturing fault, a single flawed pair, an accident of metallurgy, then nothing had been proven about anything except Sallow and Vane's quality control. The girl had not escaped a lawful restraint. She had been holding a broken one. Kashuvan would sue the manufacturer, and settle, and pay a fine, and issue a recall, and replace the Model 9s across 9 stations with Model 10s. And in 6 months, nobody would remember the name of the human child who had been sedated on the intake floor of Harrow Station, and shipped to a reactor scrub deck in a system with no name. 1 defective unit. That was all it took to make her a nobody again. And there was only one person in the Concord who could contradict it, and she was standing in the aisle with her slate on the floor. And Thoros Vale-Canth had known Vessine Orr-Talad for 11 years, and he had promoted around her twice, and he had never once bothered to learn what she was. He would. Wren heard the doors. There were 4 of them into the intake hall, and they came down at once. 3-ton blast partitions dropping out of the ceiling with a sound like a mountain sitting up, and the green light in the vault went red, and the intake queue began to scream. She was already moving. She had 2 ruined hands and a floating rib and a body that had spent every gram of itself in the last 6 seconds, and she went across that hall like something coming up a shaft with the roof coming down behind it, and she was not running for the doors because the doors were shut. She was running for the mop. The old Grenick put it in her hands. He put it in her hands, and then he took her by the elbow, all 4 of his working arms wrapping her forearm with a gentleness that had a great deal of grief in it, and he pointed with his 5th at the base of the dais, where a maintenance grate the size of a hatch sat flush in the dark stone, and he said, in the wet, terrible, effortful trade of a species whose mouth was not built for it, "CC count is under." "What?" "CC count," said the Grenick, "is under. 11 years I count, no one ask." His mouth parts worked. It was clearly agony to speak. It was clearly not the first thing he had said that day, but it might have been the first thing he had said that year. "Ask me," he said. "Ask me in the room. Ask me in front of the eye." Wren looked at him for 1 full second. "What's your name?" "Autumn." "Autumn," she said, "I'm going to come back and ask you." She got the mop handle under the grate's lip. "Don't die." "No," Autumn agreed, with what might have been the Grenick equivalent of amusement, and went back to his mopping, because there was a wet floor and it was his floor, and the arbiters were going to be walking on it. The grate came up. Wren went down into the dark. Harrow Station was a hulk. It had been a bulk or hauler once, and Keshuvin had bought it dead and hollowed it and welded a station into the cavity, and the result was a building with a skeleton that did not match its skin. Behind the ice glass and the bone-dark stone, there were 400 kilometers of the original hauler still in there. Crawlways, ballast trunks, cargo spines, cold decks that had not been pressurized in 30 years. Keshuvin did not patrol them. Keshuvin did not need to. The crawlways ran at 9 degrees below freezing and 11% oxygen, because the station's atmosphere plant did not waste heat or air on dead volume, and an Oran who went into the cold decks without a suit had about 4 minutes before hypoxia took the fine motor control out of their hands, and about 11 before it took everything else. The Draskin had similar numbers. The Vosh could not go in at all, which meant that the entire backbone of Harrow Station was, for security purposes, a wall. To a human girl who had spent 4 years on an ore face on a moon where the surface temperature at noon was -20, and the mine drifts ran at 9% oxygen because the settlement could not afford to scrub them properly, it was a hallway. Wren went through it at a dead run, on broken hands in the dark, with her breath coming out in plumes and her lungs pulling hard and her body doing the old, stupid, deathworld thing it had been built for, burning itself and not stopping. She had memorized the deck plans in the transfer pen. Keshuvin published them. Of course they did. They were a lawful company, and lawful companies file structural schematics with the Port Authority, and Port Authority filings were public. And Wren Calloway had spent 231 nights learning that the most dangerous thing you could do to these people was read what they had written down. Ballast trunk to the spine, spine to the ventral cargo run to the sublevel below the acclimatization nursery. She came up through the floor of the nursery hold at 11 minutes past the hour, blue-lipped, bleeding, with a mop handle in her teeth because her hands would not hold it, and 42 human children turned and looked at her. They were in rows, they were in gray. They had numbers stenciled on the shoulders of their coveralls, and their heads were shaved, and some of them were very small, and they had been told, every day for 8 months in kind voices, by people who were not lying, that nobody was coming. Bo Calloway was in the 4th row. She was thinner. That was the first thing, and it went into Ren like a blade. She was thinner and her hair was gone, and there was a healed burn on her forearm in the shape of a pipe, and she stood there with her mouth open, and the gap in her front teeth had closed up because she had grown 2 new ones in 8 months, and Ren had missed it and would never get it back. "Bo," Ren said. And Bo Calloway made a sound that no one in that hold ever forgot, and ran. Ren caught her with her forearms, because she had no hands to catch her with, and went down on her knees on the deck with her little sister crushed against her chest, and held her there, and said her name, and said her name, and said her name. She let herself have 4 seconds. Then she stood up, with Bo still hanging off her, and she looked at 41 other children, and she said, loud, in the flat voice her mother used to use in the shaft when something had gone wrong and there was no time. "Everybody up, boots on, hands to shoulders, front to back, no gaps. Nobody moved. Now." They moved. "Where are we going?" said a boy at the front, 14 tall, with a cough she recognized from the intake hall's twin. "The doors are locked." "They lock them at—" "We're not going through the doors," Ren said. "We're going through the asterisk floor asterisk. It's cold and it's thin and you're going to want to stop and you're not going to." She got the hatch open with her elbow and her knee. "You're from Pharaoh's Landing. You've all been down the number 3 drift. This is easier than the number 3 drift." "It's not," said the boy. Ren looked at him. He was scared and he was right and he had said it anyway. "No," she agreed. "It's not. What's your name?" "Marco." "Marco, you're on the back. Nobody gets left in the dark. If somebody stops, you pick them up." She put the mop handle in his hands. "You need a stick, that's a stick." Marco Duval looked at the mop handle, and then at the girl with 2 broken hands and blood to the elbows and her sister on her hip, and something happened in his face that was going to change the whole rest of his life. "Yeah," he said, "okay." They lost nobody. That was not luck. It was 7 kilometers of cold crawlway and 42 children, and it took 91 minutes, and 3 times Ren went back down the line in the dark to carry somebody, on forearms that were screaming, and once she carried 2, and the second one was 7 years old and named Pim, and he had stopped and sat down and said, very reasonably, that he would just stay here. She did not lose anybody, and she did not hurt anybody, and this is the part that the record shows, and the record is the record. At the junction of the ventral spine and the ballast trunk, 2 Kashuvan security officers came around the corner in cold suits with shock batons, and the first one swung at her, and Ren Calloway, who had a rock hammer's worth of shoulder and a body built by a world that ate the slow, put her forearm into his chest and threw 190 kilos of armored Oran off a catwalk. And then she caught him. She caught his suit collar with the crook of her elbow as he went, and the weight of him tore something in her shoulder that would need pins in it later, and she hung there over a 40-meter drop into the ballast dark with a man who had been trying to break her skull 4 seconds ago, and she hauled him back up onto the catwalk with a noise coming out of her that was not a word. He lay on the grating and looked up at her. "Why?" he said. It was not really a question. His voice had come apart. Ren was on her knees. She could not feel her right arm. "Because I'm not here to kill anybody," she said. "I'm here to get asterisk counted." She took his baton with her teeth because her hands were done, and she dropped it down the shaft, and she took the second officers too, and she left them both alive on the catwalk with their radios crushed, and she got up, and she went and got her children. The attester's spine ran up the central column of Harrow Station like a bone. It was a shaft of unadorned iron 4 meters across and 200 long, and inside it was the only part of the station that Kashuvan did not own, a Concord sealed evidentiary core with its own power, its own thinking, and one job. Everything the attester saw, it wrote. And when a contest of body was declared, the Corps opened an audit gate, a window during which the entire station's record was frozen, mirrored, and shipped to the nearest arbiter's writ office, and no local authority could touch it. The gate stayed open for 90 minutes. If at any point in those 90 minutes the contesting body was pronounced deceased or incapacitated by a licensed medical officer the gate closed because a contest died with the contester. It was in the law. It had been in the law for 3,000 years, and it had been written by 9 civilizations who could not conceive of a licensed medical officer who would lie. Thoros Valecanth had a licensed medical officer on the intake floor and a sedation order already filed, and a girl who was, by any honest reading, in shock, hypovolemic, and 1 bad minute from dying of her own success. He needed to find her for 11 more minutes. He did not find her, because at the 68th minute of the audit gate, Ren Calloway came out of a maintenance crawl 140 meters up the central column, on the outside of the attester's spine, in vacuum-adjacent cold, with a stolen emergency hood over her head and her sister's coverall knotted around her ruined right hand, and began to climb. There was a service gantry. It had not been used in 9 years. It went up the outside of the iron shaft in a slow spiral, and it ended at the audit vent, a hand-width slot, high on the column, where the core exhausted its heat, and where, twice a century, a conquered technician plugged in a diagnostic line. The vent had a shutter. The shutter was Kashuvan hardware on a Kashuvan circuit, and Thoros Valecanth had been trying to close it for 40 minutes, and it had not closed, because a conquered core will not permit its audit vent to shut while a gate is open. But a shutter can be jammed, and a jammed shutter reads as a hardware fault, and a hardware fault on the vent is grounds for an emergency core suspension, and an emergency core suspension closes the gate. 22 minutes left, the shutter was drawing power. Its motor was 90 seconds from stalling the vent closed. Ren got to the gantry's end with the cold going into her chest like nails and looked at the shutter, and she had no tools and no hands and nothing at all in the world except one thing. She reached into the breast pocket of her coverall and took out, between the 2 knuckles of her left hand, a curl of Varick coil the length of a finger. She had pulled it out of the intake hall wall with her teeth on the way past. A piece of her own broken handcuff. "None have," she read out loud to nobody in the dark, 140 meters up the spine of a slave station with a shutter grinding shut in front of her. Her voice was gone. She was laughing, a little in the awful hitching way of a body that has nothing left. "None will." And she jammed the shard into the shutter's track, and she put her shoulder against it, and she held it. The Richip Andre Cass von Asterisk, carrying the High Arbiter of the same name, came out of fold 19 kilometers off Harrow Station at the 87th minute of the audit gate, which was 3 minutes before the gate would have closed on its own, which is a fact that Kashuvan's council would spend the next 2 years pointing at as though it meant something. It did not mean anything. The gate had held. That was the only fact the law cared about, and it had held because there was a girl on a gantry 140 meters up the column with a piece of her own restraint jammed in a shutter track and her broken shoulder against it. And when the conquered marshals cut their way onto that gantry, they found her still there, unconscious, upright, held in place by nothing but the angle of her own bones. They had to take the shard out of the track with a cutting tool. They had to take her hand off the shard with a warm compress and 11 minutes of patience, because her fingers had frozen around it, and the marshal who did it, a Vash, 700 years old, who had come to the conquered bench out of a childhood in a debt house on Assuar, and had never once told anyone that, sat with the girl's hand in both of hers and worked the fingers open one at a time, and did not speak, and did not need to. The hearing convened in the intake hall of Harrow Station 11 days later, because Article 9 required it to convene where the contest was made, and because High Arbiter Andre Cassvon had read the file and had decided that Kashuvan Reclamation and Assurance was going to have to make its argument standing on the exact stone where it had done the thing. The chairs had been cleared out. The vaulted ceiling of ice glass let down its pale green light. 9 species sat in the gallery, and the attester watched, and the mark in the wall beside the lens, the 4-centimeter hole where a shard of Varick coil had buried itself, which the marshals had cordoned and photographed and left exactly as it was, had a small brass tag under it now, because that is what the conquered does with evidence. Wren Calloway came in on her own feet. She had wanted to, they had told her not to. She had a pinned shoulder and a cast on her right arm to the elbow, and a frame of steel pins standing out of her left hand like a fence, and she had 3 cracked ribs and a lung that was still learning its job again. And she was 17, and she came down the aisle of that hall at a slow, ugly, deliberate walk with her sister holding onto the back of her shirt, and she sat down in the 3rd chair of the front row, because it was the one she knew. Thoros Vale-Canth stood for Keshuvin. He was very good, it is important to say that. He did not bluster, and he did not deny, and he did not once say a false thing, and for 2 hours he built, in front of 9 species and an arbiter and the eye that could not be bought, an argument so clean that people in the gallery began, despite themselves, to nod. The child suffered, he said. The company does not dispute it, the company grieves it, but grief is not law and this hall is not for grieving. He laid it out. The restraint had failed, that was not in dispute. But Article 9 did not void bonds when a restraint failed. It voided bonds when a restraint was escaped, because escape proved the bond had been applied to an unwilling body, and a defective restraint proved nothing at all except that a factory on a moon 400 light-years away had let a bad coil through quality control. And this coil, he said, had been bad. He had the metallurgy. He had a sallow and vain engineer under conquered oath who testified, honestly and miserably, that the fracture surfaces on the recovered fragments showed strain patterns outside the envelope of qualified performance, which was engineer for this is not supposed to happen. He had the manufacturing batch record. He had 11 statisticians. He had a recall notice, filed voluntarily at cost that morning. 1 defective pair of bonds, said Thoros Vale-Canth, in 11 years and 1,412 sealings. That is a tragedy, and it is a liability, and Keshuvin will pay. What it is not, what it cannot be, under 3,000 years of settled law, is proof that a single other bond in this company's history was unlawfully applied. He turned and looked at the girl in the 3rd chair, and there was nothing in his face but sorrow, and the sorrow was real, and that was the worst thing about him. She was very brave, he said. She was also holding a broken lock. I am sorry, both of those are true. He sat down, and in the silence, High Arbiter Andre Cassvon, who was old and gray and had 4 eyes that had seen a great deal, said, "Does the contest answer?" Wren Calloway stood up. She had no advocate. She had been offered 11 of them. She had turned them all down, and when the marshals had asked her why, she had told them, "Because he's going to say the cuff was broken, and the only people who can say it wasn't are people he thinks he owns. If I ask them in a back room, they'll say no. So I'm going to ask them in front of the eye." 2 questions, Wren said. Her voice was still ruined. It never entirely came back. First one's for the janitor. Autumn of the Greenock came forward and stood in front of the dais with his mop, because they had told him he could put it down, and he had not understood why he would. Wren said, "Autumn, 11 years you've worked this hall. How many human children have you seen taken through it?" The gallery stirred. Keshuvin's counsel came half out of his seat, and Vale-Canth put a hand on his arm, because Vale-Canth had already seen it, and had already understood what was about to happen to him, and had already begun to sit very, very still. A Greenock cannot lie. But nobody in 11 years had ever asked him anything. Autumn's mouthparts worked. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, in that wet, terrible, effortful trade, the numbers he had been holding for over a decade. And as he said them, a marshal was already prying up the maintenance grate at the base of the dais, and lifting out the underside of it and turning it to the light. He had scratched them into the metal. 11 years of tallies in the 6 scratch clusters of a Greenwich count in rows by month, with a small mark beside each cluster for the ones that were small enough to have to be carried. 1,412. It matched Kashuv's own ceiling record to the digit. "I count," said Autumn into the ringing silence of that hall. "No one ask. 11 years, no one ask." He looked at the arbiter with his flat black eyes. "SSO I count," he said, "until SS someone does." "Second question," said Wren Calloway, "is for the sub-prefect." Vessine Orr-Talad had been sitting at the Kashuvan table for 11 days. She had been briefed. She had been prepared. She had been told kindly at length by 3 lawyers and by Thoros Vale-Canth himself exactly what she would say, and what she would say was true, that the bond had failed, that she had not observed the failure coming, that she was not a metallurgist and could not speak to the condition of the coil. All true, every word. She could say all of it and never lie once and go on being what she had been for 11 years, which was an honest woman. She stood up. "Sub-prefect," said Wren, "before you sealed those bonds on me, did you run the integrity check?" The hall was completely silent. Vessine looked at the girl in the 3rd chair, 17 years old, pins standing out of her hand, cracked voice, the same steady brown eyes that had asked her, 20 minutes into the worst day of her life, a genuine question about her life's work and had listened to the answer. "I have processed 4,006 bonded bodies in this hall," she had said, "and I have watched the humans pull every time." And she had thought it was grief. It had never once occurred to her that it might be work. "Yes," said Vessine Orr-Talad, "I ran it." "Do you run it every time?" 4,006 times, Vessine said. "Yes." "And what did it say?" Thoros Vale-Canth said, very quietly without standing, "Sub-prefect." And Vessine Orr-Talad, who had been passed over twice for filing reports nobody wanted, who had never taken a gratuity, who had spent 11 years being scrupulously, uselessly, magnificently honest inside a machine that had been eating children the entire time, and had needed her honesty to do it. Vessine Orr-Talad reached into her coat and took out her personal slate and walked forward and set it on the dais in front of the High Arbiter. "It said the coil was sound," she said. Somebody in the gallery made a noise. "Full factory tension, 40 raps, no fatigue signature, no batch flag, governor nominal, warranty current." Her voice did not shake, her hands did. "I checked them because I check them. I logged it because I log it. The log is time-stamped 19 minutes before the contest, and it is mirrored to the attester and it cannot be altered. And I am telling this court, under oath, that the restraints that came off that child's wrists were not defective." She turned and looked at Thoros Vale-Canth for a long moment. "They were perfect, she said. "That is the entire problem. They were perfect and she got out anyway, and I have been standing in this hall for 11 years telling children that no one escapes, and I was wrong, and if I was wrong about that—" She stopped. She put her hand flat on the dais to steady herself. "Then I have to find out what else I was wrong about," she said. "And I find that I already know." High Arbiter Andre Casvon ruled from the bench, which arbiters almost never do. He ruled that the restraint was sound. He ruled that the escape was therefore an escape, unaided and without instrument, from a lawful restraint, in the presence of a sworn officer, and under the eye of an attester, and that under Article 9 of the Concord of Bonds, the restraint stood proven to have been applied to an unwilling body. He voided the bond of Wren Calloway. He voided, pending audit, 1,412 bonds sealed by Kashuvan Reclamation and Assurance under the same warranty, across 9 stations, and ordered every bonded body located, examined, and offered counsel at company expense. He suspended the Kashuvan Charter. He referred Undersecretary Thoros Vale-Canth and 19 other officers, to the conquered slaving bench, which has one penalty, and it is not a fine. And then, because he was old, and because he had read the file, and because there was a mark in the wall of that hall 4 centimeters deep that he had walked over and looked at with all 4 eyes before he sat down, he added one line that was not required by any statute, and that is now printed at the front of every edition of the Concord of Bonds that has been issued since. The door was always there, he said. We built it 3,000 years ago and made it too heavy to open, and then we told ourselves that was justice. It was not justice. It was a wall with a story about a door on it. It took a 17-year-old child from a mining moon to find out which one it was, and she found out with her hands, and I will not pretend in this court that we deserved her. It took 4 years to bring them all home. Not all of them came. 209 were dead, and 19 were never found, and 140 had been sold on so many times that untangling the chain took the Concord's forensic accountants the better part of a decade. But 844 children walked off ships onto worlds they remembered, and 400 more onto worlds they did not, and Pharaoh's Landing got 59 of its 62 back, and stood at the east gate in the cold to receive them, and Des Calloway stood at the front with his hat in his hands and could not stop shaking. Autumn of the Greenock was flown to Concord Vault and given the certificate of the standing witness, which had been awarded 11 times in 3,000 years, and he accepted it and thanked them, and asked whether they had a floor that needed doing. He worked the vault's south atrium for the rest of his life. People came from 9 systems to be told the number by him, and he told them every time because they asked. Vessine Orr-Talad was dismissed by Keshuvin on the day of the ruling, and hired by the Concord on the day after, and she spent the next 30 years in the office of bond assurance walking into intake halls unannounced, and the sound of her name in a Keshuvin-shaped company was, for 3 decades, the sound of a very bad afternoon. Sallow and Vane discontinued the Model 9. The Model 10 had a governor that did not learn the hand. It also cost 4 times as much, and held about as well as a strong rope, and nobody bought it, and the company folded in 6 years, and there is a lesson in that which the Concord has never quite been willing to say out loud. And Wren Calloway got her hands back, most of them. The left one never closed all the way again. The surgeons got her 70% and told her she was lucky, and she said she knew. She was on the Harrow docking arm the day they took her home, with Bo asleep against her hip and a bag she could not carry, when Vessine Orr-Talad came and stood beside her. They did not speak for a while. Below them, through the deck glass, the frozen seas of Grieve went by in their slow green light, and Wren thought that she would never in her life have to look at that color again if she did not want to, and found that she was fine with looking at it now. Vessine held out one long hand. In it was a curl of Varick coil the length of a finger, dark, notched, with a bright scar down one side where a cutting tool had freed it from a shutter track 140 meters up an iron column. They released it from evidence, she said. It is yours. It is, I am told, the most photographed object in this sector. Wren took it awkwardly in the 2 fingers of her left hand that still worked. She turned it over. On the inside curve, in letters 1/4 millimeter high, stamped there 40 years ago by a machine on a moon 400 light-years away, there were still 4 words. None have, none will. Vessine watched her read it. I said that to you, the Oran said. In this hall, I said no one escapes those. She was quiet for a moment. 4 eyes on the ice below. I have thought about it every day for 11 days, and I expect I will think about it every day until I die, and I have not been able to work out how you did not laugh in my face. Wren closed her fingers around the shard, the 70% of them that would close. Ma'am, she said, I didn't need you to be wrong. Vessine turned. I needed you to be sure, said Wren Calloway. The whole thing only works if the cuffs are real. If they'd been junk, I'd have gotten out of them and it would have meant nothing, and Bo would still be down there. She looked up at the tall gray woman who had crouched in front of her chair and told her, gently, kindly, honestly, that the shape of the world was the shape of the world. You put the best restraints ever made on a girl who'd spent 8 months learning them, and then you told me they were perfect, and you meant it, and you logged it, and you signed it. That was the only piece I couldn't bring myself. She held up the shard between 2 ruined fingers, and the green light came through the deck glass and lay along it. You didn't chain me, she said. You witnessed asterisk me. And nobody in 11 years ever asked you to do anything else. She turned and went to wake her sister, walking slow, on a bad shoulder, with a hand that would never be right, off a station where the wall beside the attester still has a hole in it 4 centimeters deep. And behind her, in the green light of a moon that had never once been kind to anybody, Sub-Prefect Vessine Orr-Talad of the Concord Office of Bond Assurance stood with her hands empty and read, for the last time in her life, the 4 words she had spent 11 years believing. Then she went and found a station with a hall like this one, and she walked into it unannounced, and she asked the janitor for the count,